Welcome to our podcast on transport in Africa, a platform dedicated to spotlight cutting-edge research, innovation, and ideas shaping transport systems across Africa. I am your host, Polycarp Chebe. In each episode, we sit down with a researcher, a practitioner, or a change maker who is redefining how mobility works in Africa. In today's edition, we are turning our focus to Kampala, Uganda, to talk about a powerful force in African urban transport, the Boda Bodas or motorcycle taxis, or call it Okada, as we call it in Cameroon and Nigeria. From narrow alleys to congested urban highways, Boda Bodas are everywhere. But how did they come to own the streets of Kampala? Joining me is Courtright, a researcher whose work dives into the history, dynamics, and growing dominance of Boda Bodas in Kampala transport landscape. We will explore the social, economic, and political layers of this fascinating mode of transport and what it reveals about mobility in African cities. Hi Tom, good to have you on the show.
Hi Polycarp, great to be here.
Okay, Tom, before we begin, I would like you to briefly tell us a little bit about yourself and what inspired you to focus your research on Boda Bodas in Kampala, Uganda.
Thanks, man. Yeah, so I grew up in Tanzania. I'm American, but I grew up in Tanzania. Now I live in Nairobi, but I lived in Uganda for a number of years. And how I actually got in was, I was just taking bodas every day. And if you're on a boda in Kampala, you immediately understand that you are a small fish in a large school full of Boda Bodas. And that also it seems as though it is anarchic, like there's no rules. But clearly there are some unspoken rules that determine how bodas operate in the city. So I'm very interested in them because I was taking them every day to go everywhere because they're so useful for that in Kampala. And then I also started getting into electric mobility issues when I got to know a company that was starting there at the time, Zembo, back in 2018. And then really the third thing was I got to know a boda rider called Geoffrey Ndogezi, and together we started a small research group called the Beyonza Research Group and just started posting on Medium about Boda Bodas and how they work in the city. And we also started doing these quarterly surveys, which we've been doing for 3 years now. So that's how I got interested in bodas, and it's still an obsession that's driving me.
Interesting. Tom, for our listeners who may not be familiar with Boda Bodas, can you give us some context on the role of Boda Bodas in Kampala and more broadly how motorcycle taxi functions in African cities?
Sure. So in Kampala, they're a city where Boda Bodas really run the streets. So from surveys we've done in recent years, residents travel, it's clear that Boda Bodas are taking something around 35% of all trips in the city, right? So they even take more trips than minibuses. So they're just sort of completely dominant. In Kampala, you can step out of your door and almost anywhere, except perhaps a couple of really high-income neighborhoods, you will find Boda Bodas just outside your door every single time. And that's what makes them so convenient, and that's what also makes them sort of difficult to replace, because of course many people do want to replace them, but they're incredible level of convenience that is not replicable by any other means. There's no other motorized means that is so prevalent, that is so available all over the city, ready to go immediately. So in Kampala, they really provide a really wide range of trips, and everybody from low to high income takes them. Men, women take them at relatively equal rates. People send their kids to school on them. People go to the hospital on them. People obviously do a lot of commuting on them. In some cases, people will either take a boda. If they live in the outskirts, they might take a boda to catch a minibus, or from downtown, they might catch a boda after they arrive by minibus. But actually, most of the time, they're not linked trips. Most of the time they're actually one-off trips, despite what some people would like to see, at least in Kampala. Other African cities are very different. Every city is very different. So Kampala has one of the highest modal shares of Boda Bodas of any capital city that I know of. It has a much higher share of trips by Boda Boda than Nairobi, certainly, than Dar es Salaam, where you also have tuk-tuks and you have the Mwendo Kasi, that's the BRT system. Kigali might be similar. Other cities sometimes have restrictions on where Boda Bodas operate. So I know Yaoundé in Cameroon has some really interesting restrictions about Benskins, Okadas moving between divisions, between parts of the city, as well as a ban on them in the downtown. Nairobi has a daytime, weekday ban on them from BD. They often break it. Cities like Lagos have banned them entirely, using very forceful means, just impounding and destroying motorcycles that are caught offering their services downtown or anywhere in the city. So they really look very differently in different cities, and they play a different role in different cities. But
interesting to see how these very important transport modes, especially for low-income earners, varies from one African city to the other. I would like also to ask, from your topic, you talk about Boda Bodas claiming the streets of Kampala. Can you elaborate more on this to let our listeners know how this has happened in Kampala?
Yeah, it's a good question. So amongst East African cities, at least, I know in West Africa, motorcycle taxis were invented, I believe, independently multiple times in the 80s. So in Benin, they were invented sometimes in the 80s. Somebody came up with the idea in Nigeria. They were invented, I believe, in the 80s, or maybe it was late 70s. And then, they were called Okadas because there was an airline at the time called Okada Air. And it's actually named after the owner's village, which was Okada. And basically, the joke was that these guys would get you there as fast as that airline, as fast as Okada Air. In East Africa, Boda Bodas were invented first as bicycle taxis in Uganda, on the Ugandan side of the border with Kenya, in a town called Busia, or just outside Busia, in around 1976, or closer to maybe 78, is when they were invented as bicycle taxis. And then motorcycles were brought in the early 1990s. Before they happened in Kenya or Tanzania or Rwanda, it was in Uganda in the early 90s that motorcycles came in and started replacing these bicycles. And there's a number of reasons why. I mean, for one, it happened at that time for political historical reasons, which is that the NRM, which is now the ruling party, had taken power in 1986, and the president at the time, Museveni, still the president today, but at the time he was viewed as being a breath of fresh air. He had very positive rhetoric, and the country had gone through 15 years of conflict and repression and violence, and so there was a lot of money that came in, international donor money that came in to support the economy. The other thing that was happening, though, is there was still the structural adjustment programs that were being supported by the World Bank and IMF, and these mostly resulted in a lot of people losing their jobs, of course, downsizing government departments. And one of the key things that they downsized in Uganda was they downsized the military. And so they were letting thousands of Ugandan soldiers go. And obviously, no government wants a bunch of unemployed ex-soldiers, right? That's very dangerous to your government. Young men who know how to use guns and no longer have a job, right? So the government actually did quite a bit to support these guys once they left the military, and gave them some combination of what's called mabati, which is tin roofing sheets, and around 500,000 shillings. And a number of these guys, who some of them had traveled around the country and they had seen what was happening in Busia, they had seen the bicycle taxis there, decided that this was a great way to make some money, and now they had the capital to get themselves bicycles. And so a lot of the early Boda riders in Uganda were veterans. Quite a few were veterans. And the government, actually, even the president's brother, got involved supporting them. They kind of backed out a little bit later, but basically there was a lot of government support, sort of upfront support as well, sort of back channel support for this industry throughout the 1990s. And then essentially it was as Museveni made his efforts to stay in power, so 2004 I think it was, they changed the constitution to allow him to run indefinitely for president. And in order to win those, and the concession that was made by the government was that they're going to have multi-party elections. And so in order for him to win these multi-party elections, he had a number of concessions to the public, to the citizenry, and one of the key ones was getting rid of a couple of taxes which people really didn't like. One of those taxes was taxes on Boda Bodas. It used to be that town councils, city councils in Uganda taxed Boda Bodas, and they dropped all that in that era running up to that multi-party election, the first one in 2006. So this same sort of pattern has held ever since, which is any attempt at really regulating or controlling or limiting the industry has been undermined by the government. And the large reason is just that at this point, it's very much that they don't want a lot of unemployed young men, because they know if they were to ban this, probably over 1 million people are employed in this sector in Uganda, and it would be chaotic. So not only in terms of people no longer having a convenient, fast way to get where they need to go to, but there would also be a lot of unemployed urban young men, which is a danger to any government. And so it's gone that way, and the sector has simply continued to grow as the government has made these concessions in order to keep the country stable.
So it's really good to see how this mode of transport has evolved over the years, especially in Kampala, as compared to other cities where the government is trying or making all effort to see how this mode of transport is kept out of the city. And then in Uganda, we see the government struggling to support in one way or the other, even though for their own interests. So far, Tom, have you engaged directly with Boda Boda riders or associations in your research? If yes, what perspective have they shared with you?
Yeah, interesting. Of course, I talk to Boda riders and associations all the time. I think the reality is that, first of all, associations in Uganda are very unstable and they're very fractious. So associations, man, they only last like a couple of years. Then somebody at the top decides to split off and start their own association. Association membership itself is actually not high. It's actually fairly low. It's like lower than 40% of Boda riders are actually members of an association in the first place. The relationship between the members and the leadership is weak. So it's a very fractious population. I think the thing that's really interesting about Bodas, and this is the case really, I think anywhere they operate, is that they are very atomized, meaning they operate very independently. So if you think about a minibus, right, matatu, danfo, whatever you want to call them, you have somebody who owns it, right? That's not your average person because they need to have enough money, like, at least $10,000 or more in order to buy that minibus, used minibus. They're not operating it themselves, they work with the driver. Then the driver also has a conductor most of the time, and then sometimes there's even the toot or tout, however you want to pronounce it. And so all these people have to work together in order to just make one vehicle work. And then you also have to organize people along the route. And so there's usually some form of self-organization there where people come together and who's going to operate on which route, or not. But at the very least, you need to have a thing. And that is just not true for Bodas. All you need is a motorcycle. You don't need anything else. You don't need anything else at all. You can teach yourself to drive a motorcycle in about 2 hours, or a friend teaches you, and then you just start. And it's very, very fractured. And people are not united at all. And, this has a lot of knock-on effects in terms of trying to work with government and actually put an opinion forward on, various legislation that might come forward. It's very divided, and in this sort of political culture in Uganda, people will follow somebody for a while, and then if they feel like they are not, their needs aren't being met, or they don't feel like they've been helped in the way that they by that leadership, they'll leave and they'll start their own group. And so that's just constantly happening, and it means that there's no long-term association, and you can go and get the opinions of leaders, and many of them are very knowledgeable, but they don't command the kind of loyalty and respect which would really help in terms of providing a united front in negotiating improvements for the Boda Boda sector.
Yes, Tom, very interesting. There is this issue with Boda Bodas. From my own experience, especially from Cameroon and maybe Nigeria, there are issues of security that are associated with these motorcycle taxis, issues of safety. From your opinion, have you been able to talk with some users of this mode of transport? What is driving them to continue using this mode of transport, despite some of the shortcomings, like you talk about organization, that they are not well organized, some of them are not registered, and so on? What maybe actually motivates people to continue using this mode of transport?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a user of Boda Bodas even, and the reason people use them is very straightforward. They are incredibly convenient. It's just an unbeatable level of convenience. You can, where it's faster to just step out your door than it is to try to order one on a ride-hailing app. The reason that things like ride-hailing apps work here in Nairobi is because they think there's a lot of Bodas. There's not that many Bodas. There's lots of neighborhoods where, like where I live, I can't step out my door and just flag somebody down immediately. I have to walk maybe 5-10 minutes to a main road to do that. So in Kampala and in other cities where they're so common, that convenience is just unbeatable. If you want to take Matatu for the same trip, you're going to have to walk 5 to 10 minutes to where they stop. You might have to transfer somewhere because it might not have a route exactly from where you're going to where you're going, and then when you get off you have to walk again. But a Boda will take you from your doorstep to the other door, and that is really highly valued by people, and they obviously are doing it at a price that is somewhere between half to 1/4 the price of what it would cost if you were to get a taxi, like a
Yeah, Tom, from your findings so far, what has stood out to you most about this study on Boda Bodas? Any surprising findings or insights about the culture, economics, or politics surrounding Boda Bodas in Kampala that you can share?
That the economics work, and that's what matters, because every Boda rider is a self-employed entrepreneur, and every Boda rider needs to be able to earn enough money to pay for the very high costs of fuel and the high cost of the motorcycle, as well as other costs, particularly maintenance. But electric motorcycles, they're growing really quickly. 95% of electric vehicles in East Africa are motorcycles. It's going to be that way for a long time. They're going to all be, I personally believe, within 5 to 10 years, the majority of the fleet in East Africa will be electric. Sales will be 100% electric within maybe 5-6 years. So, I mean, that's great news. From many, for so many reasons, it's good news in terms of air pollution, in terms of the wastage of foreign exchange that is spent on importing petrol, reducing that. It's good news. Increasing the consumption of locally generated and very clean electricity, at least in East Africa. That's good news. So to me, it's all around a big win. Maybe one other thing I would add is it's interesting to understand different cities, Boda populations, cultures, and sort of appreciation or perspective on ride-hailing apps. So one thing you find in Nairobi, and this is a sort of stereotype about Kenyans that's often very true, which is that they're just very quick to adopt new technologies, and that
you find people who really, really believe and really tell you, listen, this is the future. Like, apps are the future. We all need to go digital. Like, it's going to happen no matter what. Let's do it. You do not find that? Absolutely not. People are like, apps don't really work. There's just very few trips that are going on apps.
So Tom, I was about coming to that aspect. I wanted to find out from you, how do you see the future of Boda Bodas in Africa in terms of their evolution? How do you see the future?
So the three big things that are happening in the Boda sector across Africa are the introduction of electric motorcycles, the introduction of formalized financing. So that means financing for motorcycles that is like from a large company and not just from, your neighbor who has a little bit more money. And third, the apps. So on the electric mobility front, like I said, particularly here in East Africa, I think the adoption is quick, and I think the demand is very high. People save money from using them. So that to me is the biggest thing. The speed at which that happens obviously very much depends where you are. Quite frankly, Bangui in the Central African Republic, I don't know of any companies there doing electric motorcycles yet. It's probably going to take longer. And in particular, when you start looking at rural areas, you look at areas that have less stable electricity, places like Nigeria, although Nigeria is so diverse, but like the parts of Nigeria that don't have very consistent electricity, it's going to take longer to adopt them, right? Because it means that you have to add solar at the station and all this sort of stuff, which increases costs. So that's going to happen at different rates across the continent. The financing thing really boils down to interest, like how the local startup and business sector generally is perceived, unfortunately, particularly by foreigners, because these financing companies, unfortunately all of these really, most of the financing companies, most of the mobility companies, most of the ride-hailing apps are foreign-owned, unfortunately. And that means that simply the perception of a market is very important. So everybody's in Kenya because everybody loves the Kenyan market. It's oversaturated. North Africa, for example, Islamic banking is very much against usury, right? It's against having exploitatively high interest rates. The interest rates by these companies is 40, 50, 60%. It is extremely high. And so actually their business model is simply illegal in some countries. So that one is going to really depend on the country. I really hope that we can follow the lessons from places like Brazil, where you have consortial banking, which is much more reasonable interest rates. It's and there's more innovations, I think, to be followed through on in terms of motorcycle financing without having such high interest rates. And then the third thing on ride-hailing apps, it really depends on the city. So yes, Nairobi, Johannesburg, Accra, these cities all have ride-hailing motorcycles now. Although Accra not legally yet, but Joburg already does, as well as Nairobi, and they're very common, and for a couple of reasons, like I mentioned earlier, partly to do with the fact that there's just not as many motorcycles, and so it is convenient to order it on an app to come to your house instead of you stepping outside and going to look for one. The other key reason being higher smartphone penetration, and then the third thing being the population's how much value people there put on safety and security over convenience. And if people highly prioritize safety and security, and they have a lot of smartphones and motorcycles are not that many, then the apps really take off. To take another example of Kinshasa, which has so many motorcycles and not very many smartphones, they probably will not have a very high penetration of ride-hailing for another 5 or 10 years at least. Things may change 5-10 years from now. Maybe higher smartphone penetration will enable the companies to basically put power in the hands of passengers, because that is very much what these ride-hailing apps do is that they get people to use the apps by lowering prices, and then passengers want to go through the app because the price is cheaper on the app, and it forces riders to have to accept trips on the app because otherwise there's no demand. So it's gonna play out differently for those three things, but e-mobility is growing quickly in a lot of regions. Financing is growing, but
so Tom, from a research perspective, are there any specific changes or contributions you would like your work to make to policy, planning, or public perception about Boda Bodas?
My research, it's not like a single journal article is coming out of this. I've been working on it for years, and I continue to work on it from different angles. So there's a few different things that I want really at this point, because it's consumed so much of my life. One thing is just to have a better appreciation of the fact that, this is a Ugandan invention. It's also a Nigerian invention. It's also a Beninese invention. We should have more respect for the fact that it is amongst other things, a genuine African innovation. There was no aid money going into this. There was none of that. There's no grants involved in the creation of Boda Bodas. Unfortunately, what I find also often is that the people who are tasked with making the rules, making the laws and regulations that govern Boda Bodas don't take Boda Bodas themselves. They're wealthy enough to have cars. They drive cars every day. And so they're often complaining about Boda Bodas getting in their way in traffic. And it's, to me, a bit of a problematic approach to legislating and regulating Bodas. And what is needed is for those policymakers to take Boda trips occasionally themselves, to spend time with Boda riders and understand them, and spend more time directly interfacing, directly getting to know and understanding the Boda sector. Each area has its own issues in terms of how legislation is made, but that's a problem I see in so many places. It's the same issue that you'd see with like the legislation of matatus as well, of minibuses. A really important thing here is that, to me, attempts to ban Bodas. We all know that a Boda Boda is less safe. Being a passenger on a motorcycle, no matter where you are in the world, and no matter whether it's in Africa or Japan or Europe or what, it is always going to be less safe being on a motorcycle than being in a car, which is surrounded by a heavy metal exterior. That's always going to be the case. However, just banning them directly because of that is not helpful. If you look at Southeast Asia, I truly believe one of the things that has really helped there is that people have motorcycles. And first of all, they control the speed in a lot of city streets, so they can't go very fast, right? Key thing is don't go over 40 kilometers an hour, and the outcome of your crash is going to be less dangerous. But there's a way to integrate motorcycles into our cities more productively. And then, finally, where I'm trying to go with that is that if you actually don't want people to take Boda Bodas as passengers, you don't want people to choose a motorcycle taxi, don't ban it. Offer something better. If you go to Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, there's a lot less trips that go on motorcycle taxis. Even though they're present in the city, but there's less trips on them. And the reason is very straightforward. There are other forms of transportation that are competitive. There are tuk-tuks, which are safer, which are everywhere, which also protect you from the sun and the dust, which a motorcycle does not do. There's also the BRT, which gets you across the city at a much lower cost than a motorcycle ever can. So you just need to provide something better. Instead of going out and trying to ban motorcycle taxis, build that BRT system, provide lanes for motorcycles or for tuk-tuks. If you just try to ban them, all it means is that low-income people are going to spend more time waiting for buses, walking across dangerous intersections where there's no crossing, and getting hit by cars, again, driven by high-income people. So to me, it is not any form of justice to just ban them outright, but instead we need to really seriously think about how we improve the system as it is, provide alternatives, and also work with Boda riders to understand why a lot of the time they don't follow the safety legislation, and a lot of the time it's because the cost is high. The cost of a driving license is absolutely unnecessarily high, $50. That is, a week and a half of your income as a Boda rider. It's completely unnecessary. The fact is that a lot of the time, policemen do not enforce a lot of the laws around safety. They do not enforce the fact that passengers should be wearing helmets in most East African cities. Kigali is the clear exception. They enforce it there, and as a result, passengers wear the helmets. And as a result, you're going to have a lower fatality rate after a motorcycle crash. So there's solutions. We know that there's solutions. And the main thing I would like to see is just less of a reflexive, reactionary, let's just...
Okay, Tom, one final question before we go. Is there any key takeaway that you like our listeners to get from this conversation? Perhaps maybe you can also want to share your future plans with our listeners.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm working on a few projects, quite a few projects. I should probably have less. And so one of those is to take this data from these quarterly surveys that we conduct and make sure that it is easily viewable and analyzable online. And it is, they're quarterly surveys of the Boda Boda sector. This is, as far as I know, the only public resource that is a recurring survey of the informal transport sector. I do not know of a single other one anywhere in the world. I'd be very happy to find out if we were wrong and there was another one. So do check that out. I'm working on a long-form history of the Boda sector, so that's going to take another year or two. So watch out for that. And then finally, I think the real takeaway is to understand how transport fits into politics, history, society here. It's very important to understand that it's a part of the fabric. And strict engineering approach isn't going to cut it. And it's also just very interesting. Once you get to know people's stories, how they end up in the sector, what happens, whether it helps them or not. It's just such a fascinating sector. So I would just say that, and also I would say look out for more podcasts from you, because I'm very excited for this Transport in Africa podcast that you're starting.
So thank you very much, Tom. It was so fascinating to see how you, even though not originally from Africa, you have a mastery of what is happening across Africa, especially with respect to Boda Boda. This brings us to the end of this podcast on transport in Africa. I wish you all the best in your research.
Thank you so much, Boyd. I really appreciate it. Good luck.
If you enjoyed this episode or learned something new, please consider to subscribe to our page. You can also contribute by sharing this podcast with friends and colleagues who are interested in transport and mobility issues in Africa. If you are a researcher or a practitioner working on transport in Africa and would like to share your work on this platform, feel free to reach out to me at chebe.campus.technion.ac.il and we can discuss how to feature you on this show. Until next time, I am your host, Polycarp Chebe. Thanks for listening and bye-bye.